Hi readers, so we are back today to share the last chapter of the BFG. I do not have vocabulary for you today because I really want to focus on what Roald Dahl does to bring this book together. He does something that's a little bit different. So this last chapter is called The Author. Now you should remember your authors, you write. So here's the author. So we know that, that he stood over the hole with the schnozzcumbers. And the queen said, "What a clever fellow you are," the queen said. "You are not very well educated, but you are really nobody's fool. I can see that." So here we move into the author. There's a little illustration there. Every country in the world that had in the past been visited by the foul man-eating giants sent telegrams of congratulations and thanks to the BFG and to Sophie. Kings and presidents and prime ministers and rulers of every kind showered the enormous giant and the little girl with compliments and thank yous, as well as all sorts of medals and presents. The ruler of India sent the BFG a magnificent elephant, the very thing he had been wishing for all of his life. The king of Arabia sent them each a camel. The Lama of Tibet sent them a llama each. Wellington sent them 100 pairs of wellies each. Panama sent them beautiful hats. The king of Sweden sent them a barrelful of sweet and sour pork. Jersey sent them pullovers. There was no end to the gratitude of the world. The queen herself gave orders that a special house with tremendous high ceilings and enormous doors should immediately be built in Windsor Great Park, next to her own castle for the BFG to live in. And a pretty little cottage was to be put up next door for Sophie. The BFG's house was to have a special dream-storing room with hundreds of shelves in it where he could put his beloved bottles. What is more, he was given the title of Royal Dream Blower. He was allowed to go galloping off to any place in England on any night of the year to blow his splendid fizz wizards in through the windows to sleeping children. And letters poured into his house by the million from children begging him to pay them a visit. Meanwhile, tourists from all over the globe came flocking to gaze down in wonder at the 9 horrendous man-eating giants in their great pit. They came especially at feeding time, when the schnozzcumbers were being thrown down to them by the keeper, and it was a pleasure to listen to the howls and growls of horror coming up from the pit as the giants began to chew on the filthiest tasting vegetable on earth. There was only one disaster. 3 silly men who had too much beer for lunch decided to climb over the high fence surrounding the pit, and of course they fell in. There were yells of delight from the giants below, followed by the crunching of bones. The head keeper immediately put up a sign and a big notice on a fence saying, "It is forbidden to feed the giants." And after that, there were no more disasters. The BFG expressed a wish to learn how to speak properly. And Sophie herself, who loved him as she would a father, volunteered to give him lessons every day. She even taught him how to spell and write sentences, and he turned out to be a splendid, intelligent pupil. In his spare time, he read books. He became a tremendous reader. He read of all of Charles Dickens, whom he no longer called Doll's Chickens, and all of Shakespeare, and literally thousands of other books. He also started to write essays about his own past life. When Sophie read some of them, she said, "These are very good. I think perhaps one day you could become a real writer." "Oh, I would love that," cried the BFG. "Do you think I could?" "I know you could," Sophie said. "Why don't you start by writing a book about you and me?" Are you thinking of anything yet? So he did. He worked hard on it, and in the end, he completed it. Rather shyly, he showed it to the queen. The queen read it aloud to her grandchildren. Then the queen said, "I think we ought to get this book printed properly and published so that other children can read it." This was arranged, but because the BFG was a very modest giant, he wouldn't put his own name on it. He used someone else's name instead. But where, you might ask, is this book that the BFG wrote? It's right here. You've just finished reading it. And look at that picture. Sophie and the BFG. So girls and boys, Roald Dahl kind of wrapped it all up as if the BFG had written this book all along, and then we shared it together. So what I love about Roald Dahl as an author is the words he uses, the vocabulary he chooses, his describing words. He does such a great job of kind of letting us use our imagination through his words. And then since it took place in England, a lot of the words were used that we don't always hear around where we live, here in Rhode Island. So great fun reading with you. And remember some of the strategies we talked about, setting a purpose for your reading. If you're unsure of a word, use context clues, read around that word, say blank, and maybe the word will come to you. So when you use all of those strategies, it's going to help you be a more successful reader, and a more successful reader leads to a more successful writer. So keep up the good work. See you for our next story.